Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be listening to a compilation of some true scary stories. I hope you enjoy them. So without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. I work as a counselor at a summer camp in Southern California. The place is very out in the woods, so we get all sorts of animals wandering through, from deer and foxes, coyotes howling in the distance, to a mountain lion that's been spotted in the area. The camp also occasionally has a spiritual/haunted vibe. There are a couple of creepy and weird spots. Some things in that area that we think show the place has been inhabited in the past. Ghost stories, etc. One night after putting my kids to bed, I was standing outside our cabin, talking to another counselor, when my friend Sadie comes running by with her entire teenage girls' cabin. Maybe 12 of them, all dressed in black and freaking out. She screams at me that she thought they heard a ghost, and once her kids were asleep, she'd meet me back here to explain and investigate. Sadie is normally the level-headed type not to freak out easily, so this really caught my attention. She meets me back at my cabin, maybe 30 minutes later, and explains what was going on. She took her campers on a night hike, had them all dress up in black and pretend to be ninjas. All was fun until their way back. They passed a particularly dark part of the trail when they heard off in the distance, just beyond the tree line, what sounded like a faint help from a small child. But each time they heard it, it got more and more distorted until it no longer sounded human, yet still sounded like a child yelling help in the distance. Naturally, they freaked out and ran. Me and Sadie decided to be good counselors and go investigate the sound of a small child yelling help. As we walk over to the area of the trail, we hear it. It doesn't sound like a small child anymore. It sounded more like a demon screeching out its best impersonation of a child. And it didn't sound like it was coming from any point source, but more was coming from an entire mountainside. We booked it back to the safety of the main part of camp, where we tell this story to anyone who will listen. The next day, the camp director had a meeting, where they told us to tell our campers not to freak out at the sound of bobcats in the forest. They are harmless, but do make a high-pitched yelping sound at night. Our friends wouldn't let us live that one down all summer. My uncle built a house on some small acreage that he has that is pretty far out there. There's not another house within 2 miles of his at least. And most of that is woods and cow pastures. But his place is beautiful. He built it all by hand and has a wonderful wraparound deck, perfect for family get-togethers. We were all out there, probably 20 adults and 5 or 6 kids for a party one day. It was one of those summer times when it's blazing hot out, but the light breeze is cool enough that you don't notice it after a while. I had been there hanging out all day when I was asked to run into town and grab some more groceries. So I packed up and headed out. I got the groceries and everything was fine. As I drove back, it was starting to get dark, and it was at a time of the year when dark comes fast. It was pitch black out there when I finally arrived. As I pull up, I notice something is sitting in front of my car, facing the house. It was not disturbed by my headlights, but it does glance back at me once. It's a panther, just chilling there, watching the party. And as I sat there for a second watching it, I notice that it has specifically placed itself near the edge, where all the kids are running around. After I have my headlights on it for a minute or so, it kind of looked back at me again as if to say, Okay, I was caught. Oh well. And then it gave the most human-looking sigh and just walked off into the woods. I sat there for a bit before building myself up to getting out of the car and going to the party and telling everyone. I went to Guatemala with my girlfriend, did a 3-day hike through the jungle to Tikal, slept in a tent at 2 tiny ranger campsites deep in the woods. During the second night, a massive thunderstorm was coming down above us. At 4 a.m., I woke up and heard some male voices, and I left the tent to check it out. 2 guys with rifles approached me, told my girlfriend to stay in the tent because it was scary. She didn't comply and joined me. Turns out, those guys were local hunters looking for shelter in the camp. We offered them coffee. They were more than happy. About 30 seconds later, the storm got so intense that a big tree fell and crashed onto our tent. If I had not left to check out the guys or worse, my girlfriend would have listened. We both would be very dead right now. When I was a kid around 8 or 9, my mom, grandma, brothers, and I went camping at a small camp about 2 hours from the town that we lived in. We went there a lot, and even had a particular campsite that we had slowly built up over the years. On this particular trip, we had my aunt and uncle's dogs with us, since they were doing military tours. They were both very well-trained bird dogs, but usually really calm and friendly. The first night on this particular trip, and one of the dogs, Star, starts growling in the tent at about 1 in the morning. My mom is thinking something is outside and arms herself and investigates with the dogs. As she gets out the tent, Star and Ariel would not let her move to the other edge of the campsite, and both get into attack position while herding my mom towards the car. This is while also keeping themselves in front of the tent. By this point, we're all up, and with a group of kids under 10 freaking out. For a reason she can't even explain today, my mother packs up camp and gets us all into the car to head home. After about 10 minutes out of the campsite, a car starts following us, and the dogs get in the back and just growl. By this point, everyone was in borderline panic mode, and my brothers were crying the entire car ride home. As the town came into view, you have to cross a huge bridge to drive in, and the car was still following us. And as a kid, you make stories to yourself that nothing is wrong, and the car behind you is just full of scared people too. Yet, as we start across the bridge, the car stops and just turns around, speeding back the way we came. We stopped at a gas station, and everyone was near meltdown mode, and my mom goes in to get cigarettes. But Star would not let her back into the car until she could see her clearly. This, and a camping trip a few years ago, later convinced me that camping is no longer my thing. I had a pretty long stint in the Boy Scouts, and one time we were camping on a reserve in the Midwestern United States that's normally used in the summer for large sessions, i.e. 1,500 scouts scattered across a large campground. We were camping in October, however, and camp wasn't in session, so it was just our troop of 30 or so guys, plus the adult leaders on this massive empty reserve. Now, the summer session has a pseudo-Native American society that serves as a leadership/craftsmanship program, sort of an extension of Boy Scouts. The Order of the Arrow would be a similar example. Part of being in the society means crafting a lot of ceremonial outfit type things. So A, you learn how to work with your hands, and B, the ceremonies look pretty cool. Well, it was the last day of our trip, and it had been unusually hot and calm for October. The last thing we do before piling into the cars is a litter line. Everyone lines up, and we walk the campsite to ensure we leave no trace. We were walking along when one of the guys says, "Hey, I think I found a coup." Now, coup are fairly valuable out there because they're a specially shaped bead that you can only get when you join the society. Everyone's coup is unique, and it's usually shaped to reflect the person who joined. Whoa, man, what kind of coup is it? Well, it looks like a tornado. Whoosh. This cold, hard wind came out of nowhere and started pushing the trees and kicking up leaves everywhere. The timing. What in the heck? Hadn't had so much as a breeze for 3 days. We decided our litter line was good and got the heck out of there. Society members don't just lose their coup. I wonder what happened. A few friends and I had a long weekend, 5 days off from school, and we decided to go camping in the North Georgia mountains. We packed a big 10-person tent. There were 5 of us, 2 guys, 3 girls, and we loaded up into my buddy's truck. He and I had some experience being outdoors, camping, hiking, and hunting, and he's an Army veteran, so we packed really well and had all sorts of amenities, like a propane stove/grill, fold-up cots, a portable shower, etc. We were in it for the whole weekend. We left Wednesday afternoon and parked the truck in a small town and started hiking into the woods to find a spot. It was a fairly normal hike until we got about 4 to 5 miles in. The first time we noticed something strange was when we came into a little clearing in the woods with a big pond/tiny lake in it. We stepped into the open area and everything stopped. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around. Even the clouds and wind seemed to stop moving. My buddy and I both thought, well crap, there's gotta be a predator nearby, and took out our handguns. It's the law in Kennesaw, just in case. I've never seen a bear in Georgia, so we figured that it was a mountain lion or maybe some coyotes. My friend and I were looking through the edge of the clearing, and he grabbed me. He nodded across the water, and when I looked, I saw what seemed to be a woman standing just at the tree line. She was maybe 150 yards away. We assumed that she must live somewhere nearby, and so we continued walking past the water and clearing. As we headed back into the woods, I looked over my shoulder at where she was standing, but she was gone. The sounds of the forest returned once we got into the trees. We made a campsite about 2 miles past that, as it was getting late and we didn't want to be stuck building a camp in the dark. We got everything unpacked and set up and built a fire, popped a couple beers, and sat down to hang out. There was a girl that I was interested in on the trip, and we had been flirting, so after a few beers and the sun was down, we snuck away from the fire under the pretense that she wanted help setting up part of the tent. We started fooling around, and after a few minutes she stopped and looked at me funny. I asked what was wrong and she said, "Nothing. It just got really quiet." We both quickly dressed and headed back outside to the fire. The others hadn't noticed anything strange and didn't mention anything wrong, except joking with us that it took us a long time to fix the tent. On the first morning, we found that the propane stove had been turned on, but not ignited, and had gone empty overnight. None of us had used it. The second morning, we noticed some things had gone missing. A lantern we left outside by the fire was gone. My crush's sweatshirt that she left on a little folding chair/stool. We figured we just misplaced things, or that someone had used them and put them somewhere else. During the second full day, Friday, we were looking for a waterfall that we read online was in the area. We were following the river upstream when everything went silent again. My buddy nudged me while we were walking and indicated up to the top of a hill next to the river. I looked up through the trees and was just able to make out the figure of the same woman, same clothes and all, just standing. I couldn't tell if she was looking at us or not, but she was standing there. My buddy told the girls that he saw a mountain lion following us and that he was going to go scare it off. He hustled up the hill, making a lot of noise, and came back about 10 minutes later. He said he scared it off to the girls, but told me aside that the woman wasn't there when he got up there. We found the waterfall and put it out of our minds as the girls decided to skinny dip in the river. We hiked back to camp and found it a mess. It wasn't totally trashed, but it was clear that something had gone into our stuff. We told the girls it was probably raccoons. We both took our guns to bed with us. That night, stuff went sideways. I remember waking up because my crush was squeezing my arm. We had been sleeping cuddled up together. I opened my eyes, and she hushed me before I could ask what was wrong. There was complete silence all around the tent. I looked across the tent, and my buddy was sitting halfway up looking around. We both stayed awake for the next 2-ish hours until the sun started coming up, and then packed our stuff and we all headed out. The entire hike back to town was eerily silent. There were a couple of points that I thought that I saw the woman through the trees, but I never got a clear sight of her. We avoided the lake completely and got back into the truck in what seemed like half of the time that it took to get out to the camp. After we were safely on the road back home, the girls and my buddy all started to tell everyone about moments that they thought that they heard/saw the woman all weekend, but were too freaked out to mention it out loud, like she would go away if we ignored her. The wild part was that none of us could describe her face. It's almost like it was blurry. I have no idea who she was, but I have never been camping or hiking at night ever since. I went camping by myself way out in the middle of nowhere in north-central Pennsylvania. Drove on dirt Forest Service roads for over an hour, and then hiked about 6 miles in on a barely recognizable trail. There were no signs that anyone had been in the area recently. The trail was almost completely overgrown, no footprints, spider webs everywhere, etc. I didn't really have a planned stopping point. I was just looking for a nice place to camp. But the trail followed a creek in a valley and was very rocky and not flat. As the sun is starting to set, I came upon a fork in the creek with a nice flat spot just on the other side. As I got closer, I saw all sorts of stuff laying about. I crossed the creek and started looking around. There was a tarp on the ground by a stone fire ring, a log about a foot in diameter that had been chopped with an axe. A little bit away, I found the entire contents of what you'd imagine to find in a hiker's backpack. Food, a cooking set, camping pad, first aid kit, etc., all strewn about on the ground, but no backpack in sight. There was a pile of clothes down by the creek that looked like it had just sat through the last rain, which was the day prior, and a towel hanging from a tree. There was an area that had clearly been used as a toilet for maybe 10 to 14 days based on the amount of toilet paper piles. The strangest thing, though, was this cage about 4 foot square, made out of saplings tied together. It was framed where the edges of a cube would be, and then had crossbars diagonally on each face. But it wouldn't have kept anything inside because of how much open space there was, and obviously wouldn't have been very sturdy since it was only made from saplings. I ended up deciding to set up camp there, because it was nearly dark and I didn't really have much choice, unless I wanted to hike out in the dark on an unrecognizable trail. I had a 12-inch knife on me, and I kept that thing in one hand the whole time that I was there, thinking that some crazy guy was going to jump out and try and eat me. All night I barely slept, and kept thinking that I was hearing things. And then, as soon as the sun came up, I packed up and got the F out of there. Everything turned out fine. No crazy cannibals or anything. But it still really bugs me, because I don't know what that stupid wooden cube frame cage thing was. I called the Forest Service for the area and told them about it. I even sent them pictures. They said they'd send a ranger in to check it out and clean it up, but I never followed up to see if they figured out what it was. The ranger on the phone told me that it was probably either someone with a still nearby, someone growing pot, or just some loner living out in the woods. I roamed up the sides of the valley before I set up camp and didn't see anything. A still seems unlikely because of how far you would have to carry equipment in, and the area really isn't great for growing pot. So maybe it was just some guy living out in the woods. But why the cage? If there's any interest, I can probably find the pictures. Oh yeah, and last year I was camping out in Colorado and woke up at about 2 a.m. to a pack of coyotes running through my camp howling. Sounded like at least 20 of them. My dog was asleep next to me the entire time. Probably best that he didn't wake up though. He would have gone nuts. And I'm told that coyotes are much bolder in packs. I went to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia with a college buddy. JMU is super close, so he and I took some camping gear from work and headed up there to catch that Perseid meteor shower. We hiked a good ways in, on, and out a back trail that ended up with a cliff overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains and was awestruck. I set up my 2-person tent and he rigged his hammock with a tarp a few yards back. And then we sat on a cliff and watched the stars go by. Here's where life got real for me. We go to bed pretty early that night, and around what I could only guess was 3 a.m., I start hearing tapping sounds all around my tiny tent. Now I knew it wasn't rain or him playing a joke on me, so I started to panic a little. At this point, I've been fully awake and alert for 10 minutes, and I can easily hear his tapping. I finally grow a pair and decided to turn on my flashlight. And what do I see when looking straight up through the mesh top of this tent? Hundreds and hundreds of centipedes. They were falling like a gentle drizzle all around my tent, and I felt like I was on an episode of Fear Factor. Long story short, I didn't sleep that night, obviously, but my buddy, who was about 15 feet away, was out like a rock. In the morning, there were dead centipedes everywhere. I'm normally fine with bugs and insects, but not swarms. I don't know how we didn't see any centipede carcasses the day before, or when setting up camp. I went on a group retreat type thing over a fall weekend about 8 years ago. My husband and I and our 3 girls, all under age 10. This was an annual occurrence, but we were flush that year as a result of our company doing well. As a result, we avoided the communal bunkhouses and decided to rent a camper. The RV rental place explained that it would cost the same for 3 nights as it would for 2, so we decided we'd return it on Monday, despite the retreat being over earlier on Sunday. So the weekend went great. It was super hot and we were happy to have AC. We didn't notice it at the time. Different people being in and out all day, not staying in the RV much over the weekend because of activities. But the previous renters hadn't bothered to clear out the septic lines in the camper. By 6 o'clock Sunday evening, it stunk horribly and was backing up into the toilet. My husband was anxious about the rental company blaming us, so he decided to go to the Walmart in the neighboring town for some Drano. Mind you, this particular location, while open all year, is rarely occupied outside of retreats. I'll confess that we haven't been back since this occasion, so the details of why don't really come to mind. But as I recall, it was privately owned by a church in the area, and they used it mostly for their own purposes and events. So my husband leaves around 8:30 p.m. for Walmart. It's an hour-plus round trip thanks to the rural area and skinny back roads. I start straightening the camper, packing our belongings and getting the kids settled. He'd been gone for about 40 minutes when I had gotten everything squared away and delivered the last glass of water to an overexcited child who'd been on the move all day and was having trouble relaxing. I curled up in the bed to read and wait for my husband to get back, in case he needed help. The lights had been out for about 20 minutes when I started hearing a clicking sound coming from the window behind the bed. I stilled instantly and ran through a self-reassuring checklist. It's the trees scraping against the glass, nature, a sound in the environment nearby, or an axe murderer. That was option 2. I got up and walked very slowly to the kitchen. The noise followed. As I was climbing up into the loft area over the trunk can, I hear the door handle rattle and then the scraping sound. I'd gotten a knife as I passed through the kitchen, which I was sweatily clutching as I hauled down on the edge of the bed in the loft, guarding my children. I eyed the cabin, making sure every access point was locked, and hoped that whoever it was definitely a whoever at this point, would go away. I leaned left and right, trying to get signal on my cell phone to call camp security or my husband or anyone, but it wouldn't dial. I waited, panicking. It was about 5 minutes of torture later that I saw headlights through the portholes on the side. Coming along the winding road to the RV sites, and my husband entered the cabin, looking at me weird. He scoffed at me for being a city girl, and told me that people didn't break out of prison and attack women and children in random rural campgrounds. I expressed that I'd heard the door rattling, and that it wasn't a coincidence of nature, but he brushed me off. We passed the test of the night without incident, though I was too on edge to sleep. The next morning, we drove into the town to return the RV. On the once-over, demanded by the rental agreement, the manager came around to my husband and asked if he knew what had happened to the rear window. It seems that someone had used a switchblade or some similar item to remove the gasket from around the window where the back bedroom was, where I'd been reading the night before. There were gashes in the paint, consistent with knife marks, and the gasket had been sliced off. The window lock was also damaged. It seems whoever had done it had also tried inserting the knife into the door's lock and between the jamb and the lock in another attempt to gain entry. Fortunately, they didn't get in, and we were not charged for the damage to the RV. Needless to say, I never consented to a solo camping trip again, and I always go in a larger group now. Safety in numbers and all that. But it still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. In the late 80s, I was in my early 20s, and 2 friends and I went camping in Central Florida. 2 of us were working for the Park Service at that time, so we were able to camp for free in other parks in the state. Both of us had done a lot of camping before. Me, I grew up camping with my family on every single vacation, all over the state. For the other friend with us, this was her first camping trip ever. We were camping in the youth area, which was empty that weekend and was quieter and more isolated than the regular campsites. Later in the afternoon, on the second day of our trip, we were all sort of spread out in the area of the campsite, being within shouting distance but enjoying a little solitude. I was collecting firewood. Every now and then, I'd kind of feel like someone was watching me. I'd look around, see and hear nothing, and then shrug it off and just go back to what I was doing. Later on, around sunset, we had the bonfire started. One of the rangers who lived on site, about a quarter of a mile away, came over with a truckload of firewood and a 6-pack of beer. We all sat around talking for a while. Well after dark, we could suddenly hear what was probably a bunch of teenagers fooling around on one of the trails a couple of miles away. Since the trails were closed at sunset, the ranger and my coworker drove off to shoo them back to their campsites. My other friend and I were just relaxing around the fire, talking a little, mostly enjoying the night and the peace and quiet. All of a sudden, I had a cold chill go over me. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and out of nowhere, I was terrified. I tried to ignore it, but it kept building. I didn't say anything to my friend. I didn't want to scare her. Then I glanced over at her just as she glanced at me, and she said, "Do you feel that?" I said, "Yeah." I think maybe we'd better go to the car. We both felt like we were in deadly danger, but no idea from what. We started walking at a casual pace, not wanting to appear scared. Then, halfway to the car, we looked at each other again and simultaneously broke into a dead run. We reached the car, jumped in and locked the doors, and turned on the headlights. I just sat there with my pistol, feeling like it was totally inadequate for whatever was out there. We both just sat looking straight ahead. We were afraid to look around. I had the feeling at one point that if I turned my head and looked out the window, I'd see something that would drive me insane. I don't know how long we sat there. It was probably just a few minutes, but it felt like forever. Then it just left. We could actually feel it going away. A few minutes after that, the other two came back in the truck. We kind of laughed it off afterward, but I'll tell you, I've never been that scared before or since. I've faced a lot in my life, and nothing has so completely terrified me like that. I don't know what it was, but I'm still convinced that we were in terrible danger. I lived by a state park as a kid, one of those places super close to a city, so it's very overhiked. Like, you can't walk a single minute without passing several other people. This area eventually leads up into a vast mountainous area, but that's many, many miles away. Rumors of wild pigs, but no bears, and the most dangerous thing are rattlesnakes that just want to be left alone. All that to set up for this point. Wildlife has been basically chased out of their refuge. The biggest animal I had seen was a squirrel until I was 10 years old. The first incident, my dad and I were taking the slightly less used path. It was basically an out-of-the-way trial that ended the same, but was rougher, no bicycles, and an added risk of seeing the aforementioned rattlesnakes. I was watching my footing when my dad let out an, "Oh crap." I looked up and saw two of the biggest bucks I have ever seen in person. This is a no hunting park, so really big. And we were really close, as my dad had been watching out for me. My dad is desperately looking around for a tree that I would learn later, while I go, "Oh dear." "Sedina, no," my dad yells as I step towards the deer, so I can see if they're friendly. One lowers his head and I'm thinking it wants to be petted. My dad realizes that I'm closer to the deer than I am to him, and this causes him to freak out. The deer are focused on me, one head down still, till a branch hits it across the face. It barely phases it, though the other one takes off immediately. After some cursing from my dad, it finally prances away like no big deal. My dad was convinced that the buck was about to charge me. I got an education that day, that even nice animals can be dangerous. I would learn that lesson again with a nice herd of cows on the beach a year later. Later that fall, a mountain lion was spotted from a very busy trail. Kinda far, but it's been like 20 years since a sighting. It turns out, despite the crowds of people, conservation efforts were paying off. By the time I was in my 20s, deer were jumping in our backyard to eat our roses. Owls were nesting right next to the main parking lot. The wild pigs weren't rumors anymore. The lions could be heard screaming in the distance at night. And the rattlesnakes still just wanted to be left alone. I really love through hiking and climbing, so I sleep outside for a great part of summer each year, almost never using tents because they're super heavy and also prohibited at most parts of my mountains. I had many scary encounters with animals, mostly due to the inhuman shrieks that they can produce. But I tell you this, In all of nature, nothing is so scary as people. This is why I prefer camping deep in the woods to being just outside of the city limits, because it's always better to find family of wild hogs going through your stuff at 3 a.m. than to find a family of coked out drug addicts going through your stuff at 3 a.m. But anyways, here are two of the stories of encountering people that came to my mind. The first one, we were actually using tents because this was a more of a get together and get drunk sort of thing with my classmates at a nearby lake. So the night is surely upon us, so we decide to gather some wood in the nearby forest to keep the fire going through the night. Me and my pal take on this task, and as we approach the woods, we see that there is another tent pitched right outside of the site of our camping site. As we pass it, a dude pops out of the tent. We make small friendly chat about us staying there, and him just camping and whatnot. And then we excuse ourselves that we need to get some wood for the fire. All fine and dandy, nothing unusual. Camping folks are usually chatty and friendly. Except for two things. By the setup of the tent and campground, he must have been there for a few days, and he planned to stay there for a while. Which is okay. There are a lot of photographers doing this, as the place is famous for its sunrises. Although I still shiver thinking about all the heavy tarps lying around. And secondly, he advises us to split, as there were two paths going through the woods, so that we can cover more ground. Which we did, because why not? It looked like he knew the area. So I'm walking alone through the woods, my friend taking the other path which is directly above mine, and he could still see down my trail. When I hear him shout my name, I turn around to see what's happening, and I see the guy from the tent following me on the trail, which he saw from above, wielding a machete. The guy says that after we left, he realized that we didn't have any axe or anything to chop down the wood, although we said collecting the wood. Also, chopping it down would be illegal there. So he thought that he would help me with that, which I politely refused and got the heck out of there, meeting my mate who was already on this route earlier. So we came back to the camping site with next to no fuel for the fire, and everyone keeps making fun of us, that we're paranoid and the guy just surely wanted to help. Whatever. We proceed to drink and night falls. We had almost forgotten about the incident, and all is well again. When I see a headlamp approaching our campsite, it's that guy from the tent coming to our site. He's bearing a bunch of wood in his arms, saying that he knew that we didn't take much of the fuel, so he brought us some. Then he walks all around our campsite before putting it down. I mean, there was really no need for that as the fire was in the middle. Checking the tents, asking whether this is all of us, and if someone else is coming. Not creepy at all. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he tells us to enjoy our night and gets out. Understandably, everybody is creeped out by now, and different theories pop up, such as that he brought the wood only to make sure that he wouldn't kill the fire before we go to sleep, so that he knows when that happens, or that the occasional flash from the direction of his campsite is the flash from his binoculars. Well, no one went to sleep that night, and we were not drinking anymore. After the sun went up, we took our 2-hour nap rotating guards, and we packed our stuff and left as soon as possible. The other one. We were on a climbing trip and slept under the stars really deep in the woods and well off all of the well-known trails and places in the areas, as sleeping there is prohibited, and the rangers are very strict about this, issuing very large fines if they catch you. So essentially, we were hiding deep in the woods. We cooked some great dinner. Man, nothing tastes as good as an MRE after a full day of climbing, camped out in the mountains. We drank some wine. We talked for a bit, and we went to sleep as we were really tired. At about 2 a.m., we were all woken up. There was 4 of us. We were woken up by voices. It sounded like a school trip somewhere in the distance. Lots of kids talking to each other, presumably walking in a group. That itself was super scary. A bunch of kids walking in the woods at 2 a.m. and they must have been off any trail, as we went on purpose out of reach of any known trails. No one is talking. We all sit there and listen. The voices pass. Then the second wave of similar group of voices passes nearby, and then we hear someone approach our sight through the woods. There must be more of them based on the sounds they're making. And then it happened. It was a group of 5 kids, roughly 13 years old, walking in the direction of the voices. They walk around our sight, silently greeting us and nodding in our direction as they pass about 3 meters from our sleeping bags and continue towards all the voices. To make it all more creepy, none of them had any headlamps or flashlights or any sources of light. It was a full moon, so the visibility was good, but still. I have no idea what was that supposed to mean, but it was really weird and honestly scary. It could have been some scouts as well. That was well-established outdoorsy place, the whole area. But still, a bunch of kids alone in the woods, well off of any well-known trail, walking without any source of light at 2 a.m., just right by us. That's creepy. There are lots of weird things happening when you camp. But trust me, nothing is as scary as other human beings. I'm pretty late to the party, but my mother has a great camping story. In their late 20s, her and my father were teaching in Lesotho. On the holidays, they would go on camping trips in the massive parks in Zimbabwe. They were young and stupid, and didn't know the dangers of camping in Africa. And they had my sister with them, who would have been less than a year old at the time. One night, they were camping in a tent, and my sister was between them, when they heard sounds inside. They say it sort of sounded like someone coughing. My sister was making baby noises, and it seemed like it attracted more coughing animals outside. Soon, it sounded like a whole pack of something was outside the tent. My parents had no firearms, and no knife or axe close by. One of the animals then started sniffing the tent, and it seems like it was trying to dig under it to get to my now crying sister. My panicked parents were trying to find a way to save themselves and my sister, and in a panic-induced rage, my mother, with all the might and glory that only a mother who is scared for her child's life can produce, punches the snout of the hyena sniffing the tent. To this day, my parents swear that the animal screamed in terror, and the whole pack ran off. Growing up in the woods and going camping, my family and I have had our fair share of bizarre and scary stories. This one, I just can't seem to wrap my head around, even to this day. My parents own 35 acres of property in the Deep Rockies, about 2 to 3 hours away from our home. We spent as much time as we could camping there, as we all loved it. It was secluded and beautiful, and we had a lot of freedom there as kids. My parents were both experienced campers and backpackers, and had both grown up in the mountains. One day we head up at night, arriving at the property at around 9 or 10 p.m. We were all pretty tired and start to unpack the tents and such from the car. The minute we get out, though, we all get a strange feeling. It didn't seem normal or good. We had encountered wild predators at this point, and knew the feeling of being watched. But this was like being watched from all sides. We also all notice that there are no sounds. It is dead silent. Normally, we would be hearing all of the insects and occasional howls, nighthawks, or bats, and just the general hum of a forest. Nothing too serious. We all kind of laughed nervously and maybe mentioned a few things, but got to work setting up our tents nearby. This is when the real strange stuff starts to happen. We begin to hear rustling in the branches around us, about 10 feet off the ground, it seems. It almost sounded like large creatures like monkeys or raccoons, jumping from tree to tree loudly. And many of them. I have never seen raccoons have the ability to do something like that. And these sounds were clumsy, unlike birds. It gets louder and louder and becomes extremely unnerving. At this point, the tent is set up, and my parents put my brother and I there, telling us to stay inside. They go out with flashlights, trying to make sense of this bizarre activity. As they're outside, we start to hear these bizarre calls. I've never heard anything like this before or since. Honestly, it almost sounded like humans mimicking some kind of primate holler or screech. There was an odd human-like aspect to it, and it's like they were calling and responding to each other from every direction, along with the branches crackling and rustling. My parents came back to the tent and tell us that they couldn't see anything at all. I remember how shocked and frightened my mom looked, and it scared me because she was not scared of anything, and she would stalk bears just to get a good photo. Both of my parents were not easily frightened in nature, or at all. We're all huddled together in the tent, confused, scared, and unsure of what to do. The sounds are so loud, and everywhere it almost sounds like some crazy storm outside. Our dogs are covered in between us all, totally freaked out. My dad decides to go out again, and I remember as he finishes unzipping the tent, the sounds stop, just like that, in an instant. And the oppressive, weird feeling is gone. He and my mom go out again to investigate, and again find nothing, except fallen branches and some strange marks up high on some trees. They come back, talk us down, and somehow manage to get us asleep. We still talk about this to this day. None of us know what happened and have no explanation. Like I said, we had some crazy and strange things happen to us, but never anything remotely similar to what happened that night. I was living in Brazil, and a friend and I decided to do a one-night out and back through mountainous rainforest terrain in one of the southern states. We mostly wanted to get some exercise and do a gear shakeout before going on a longer trip in Patagonia. The experience started out really tough. We were doing almost constant climbing, and it was hot. Humidity was near 100% through lush vegetation. Eventually, we were pretty much in clouds and completely drenched from sweat and humidity. It was kind of hellish, soaked to the bone with no chance of drying out. Fortunately, at that altitude, it gets below freezing quite frequently at night, so there weren't many insects or animals, only birds. We hiked for probably 8 hours with little progress. It was slow going through tough terrain. At early evening, we came to a flat spot, the first we'd seen in hours, and decided to make camp as it was starting to pour. I basically made camp in several inches of standing water. I was beat anyways, so I just sat in my tent reading. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a girl singing in the distance. The singing kept coming closer until she was singing right at our tents. She pushed past us, and the singing drifted off. She was singing maybe a lullaby or a children's song about rain in Portuguese, but it sounded very strange. An hour later, I got woken up to the singing in the distance again. She was coming back towards us, singing the same rain song. As she passed us, I could hear a little exasperation in her voice. She continued singing and went back in the direction of the trailhead. Another hour later, I was again woken up by her singing, as she was again coming back towards us, except now, she was also crying. She continued to cry and sing as she moved past us for the final time. We woke up that morning, looked at each other, said what the heck was that, and then got on our way. It was very eerie at the time, and I don't have an explanation for it. We were in an extremely isolated location, and the trail was definitely only used by recreational hikers. So I really can't say why this woman was out wandering, singing, and crying at 3 a.m. My family has a cabin. It's really just an old mobile home in the middle of the woods in northern Michigan. We've had it for years and years, but only recently some unexplained odd things had happened, and the police have been out to search the place. The last time I went to the cabin was the worst experience. I went up with my friend. For context purposes, we're two girls in our late 20s, and we arrived at dark. We got out and unloaded, but had trouble turning on the power. It has an outside electrical box, because the lock was frozen shut. We were trying to get it unstuck, but kept hearing noises around the cabin. Finally, it sounded like the noises were very close to us, and as we weren't getting anywhere with the lock, we rushed inside in case it was a bear milling around. We sat inside for maybe 5 minutes before deciding to drive out to the nearest town to get a motel for the night. We would come back once it was light to get the power on. We grabbed a few things and headed back out to the car. I got in and turned the car on, but nothing. The car was 100% unresponsive. The doors wouldn't even lock. My car had absolutely no issues. We had just driven 3 hours to the cabin without any problems. Something had to have happened to the car in the few minutes that we were inside. I told my friend we needed to get back inside. We got to the door and locked up behind us. We looked at each other, suddenly scared. Our car was totally dead. We had absolutely zero cell phone service, and we had no power. We tried to stay calm. We made a new game plan. We were just going to rough it for the night. And then, at first light, walk in the direction of civilization until we got cell signal or ran in to help. Only a short time later, we were sitting together in the living room, quietly talking. Suddenly, there was 2 sharp, loud knocks on the back door of the cabin. We absolutely both froze. We sat there, horrified and shaking, just waiting for someone to push their way into the door or window. This was a mobile home, so it would take very minimal effort to break in. We were met with only silence, but now knew someone was outside. What did they want? It was much scarier to think that they hadn't broke in. They just potentially sabotaged our car and were now knocking on our door to toy with us. We sat, silent and terrified. After a while, we started talking again, only to have someone bang on a window. Just one loud smack. I've never been so scared in my life. We quickly realized that we had to stay alert and awake until morning. We just had to hope that whoever was outside didn't try to get in. It didn't, but the pattern of the knocks on the window continued for hours. As soon as the sun was up, we ventured outside. We took a look under the hood of my car next. It turns out the bolt that clamps the metal piece to the battery terminal was loosened, almost completely. The nut was all the way loosened. 1 or 2 turns more, and it would have fallen off completely. I'm not sure what I saw. I've lived at my current house in North Carolina for about 3 years. When I first moved in, I had all kinds of weird encounters at night. I would be outside burning off tree limbs and things like that. I always felt like something was watching me. After the first few nights, I heard what sounded like someone calling for help, very muffled from the woods that surround my house. I shrugged it off. After a few times of that, I was walking the tree line and looking for more wood to throw on the fire. Keep in mind, this was at about 1 to 2 a.m., and I had a 30-30 shell thrown at me. I don't own a 30-30, so I thought it was very weird. Anyway, this goes on for a few months until my ex came, and we brought our kids to live in the house. My ex had chickens and a pig that got out of their enclosure and were killed. She threw the carcasses into the woods. I know. I don't know why she did that either. But after that, all the spooky stuff stopped. No more eerie feelings. No noises. Nothing. Now fast forward to last month. I've since gotten a new girlfriend, and she takes our dogs out in the early morning hours before she leaves for work. I leave the house at 4:15 a.m., so it's probably about 5:30 a.m. or so when she's out with them. Twice in the last 2 months, she's seen what she described as something large and pale in the wood line. The first time was last month. It saw her and hurried off. This morning, as she was walking the dogs, our large dog was barking like crazy, and she saw this white creature again. She said it moved like it was scuttling, larger than a deer and on all fours, but almost like what a human looks like running on all fours. As soon as the dogs got a good look at it, they began trying to run back into the house. She and the dogs flew back inside, and she got ready to leave for work. She didn't see anything else so far, but I'm just wondering what's up. What could we do? What does it sound like? All the other encounters I've had, I never saw a physical form, only noises and eerie feelings. According to her, this thing has moved closer to the house up the wood line. I'm just kind of lost. I doubt shooting at it would help. Any advice or theories would be welcome. I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I would like to know if anyone has seen something similar. Around 2 years ago, one of my friends was moving from the Appalachian region to Florida in a few days, and we decided to go catfishing before he left. We didn't catch anything that night on the river, and we left around 2 to 3 a.m. On the drive back, we hit a fog. I remember the window was cracked because I was smoking a stogie. My friend was half asleep in the passenger seat, but still conscious. I had just looked up from changing the song on my phone, and right in front of the car was what I can only describe as a shadow being. It was tall and stood on 2 legs. It had no color or details, just a black void in the shape of an upright silhouette. It was right in front of my headlight too, and it still didn't show any detail. The thing about this whole experience that terrified me the most was after it had passed us, it smacked the weeds and tall grass on the side of the road, and it made such a loud sound because of how fast it was moving. Hearing that noise after what I had just saw sent a chill down my spine. My friend and I didn't say much, except to confirm to ourselves that we had indeed saw what we saw, an Appalachian shadow man. I've never seen something like that before or since. Please comment if someone has seen something like this. It would be interesting to get more insight on what I saw that night. Last year in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I took my girlfriend out hunting. A couple of hours in and we weren't really seeing anything. I bent down to grab a beer, which was on the other side of my girlfriend. As I came back up, I glanced out the window to see if there were any deer, but I saw this tall, lanky, pale and bald creature of some sort, running through the woods faster than anything I've ever seen. I'd have to say it cleared a 100-foot section of the woods in at least a couple of seconds. Luckily, it never saw me, or so I think. It looked like it was trying to run behind the blind. Safe to say that my girlfriend and I got the heck out of there ASAP, with a fully loaded 30-30 and not much else. Not that that would have done anything to that thing. The scariest part about this story is that my girlfriend finally got to see it with her own eyes, running across the highway right by my land. Meaning, it's still stalking my woods. What do you guys think this is? I've been teetering on a skinwalker for about a year now, but now that I've found this subreddit, I like to get others' opinions. Thank you for reading. This was a few years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. A friend and I were in the woods just taking a hike. While on our way, we noticed that the forest had gone completely silent, and there was a chill to the air that hadn't been there earlier. Now, I live in the North Georgia mountains, so a sudden change in weather isn't that strange. But this was different. Along with the silence, there was this sense that something was very wrong, and something very dangerous was near. It was such a strong feeling that we became frozen in fear and apprehension. It all came to a head when our eyes caught movement behind a rather large tree. Now, for a bit of context, the air had gotten so cold that we could see our breath, and it was August. What we saw was a creature that had a deer skull for a head, with antlers that extended more flat out than up, and a pitch black cloak that seemed to suck the very daylight, and it became noticeably darker. It had bone hands with sharp claws at the ends that it had stretched around the tree as it leaned around to stare at us with its pitch black eyes that felt like a void of darkness and terror. We could see its breath in the chilly air, and as it stared at us, we both had this complete belief that if we turned our backs and ran, we would disappear forever. After what felt like an hour, but was maybe just a few seconds, it seemed to have gotten or done whatever it wanted, and leaned back behind the tree and disappeared. And the temperature returned, and so too did the sounds of the woods slowly, but surely. My friend won't talk about it to anyone, and I've only told one other person about what I saw that day. It was so terrifying that I won't ever forget what I saw. It will forever haunt my dreams and memories. I don't know what I saw that afternoon, but I was hoping that maybe if I shared it, someone else might have seen something similar, and might have an idea as to what we saw. So I live in a rural area, which in the past used to be a farmland, but since has been reclaimed by the forest. There is very dense undergrowth, such as thorns and vines and a lot of stuff to trip over. Anyway, there's a trail that I walk every day multiple times, as I like to smoke back, but there's this trail, it's the only clear path through the woods. It leads in for about 150 feet, and then stops in a dead end. This was my favorite spot. I still walk it today, and have for 4 years. Usually I wake up and go straight to my trail before I'm even fully awake. So one day last summer, it's 11 o'clock a.m., because typical teenager. I'm half awake and walking the trail. I'm almost at the end when I hear the underbrush rustling with the sound of something bipedal, moving fast. So naturally I'm like, what the heck? And I'm looking for the source of the sound, when I see about 20 feet away from me, past the end of the trail, a large black figure taking off away from me. Now I stand an even 6 feet tall, and whatever this was probably just as tall or taller than me. Once I realized what was going on, I took off running back to my house. Now I realized that it was most likely a person who got caught, but they weren't supposed to be there. But it's fun to think that I could have encountered a Bigfoot in my own backyard. And ever since this happened, I'm always paranoid that someone or something is watching me in those woods. It's made me extremely hyper-aware, and I feel like those woods aren't mine anymore. Also, if it was a person, what the heck were they doing sneaking through the woods so close to my house? And then sprinting away when they got caught. I don't really know where to post this, or if it's even going to be seen, but I had seen a fairy in the west half of Colorado. I was camping and hiking and decided to go off the trail a bit, but keep it in sight so that I wouldn't get lost. I was going around this tree and saw something flying towards me. I thought it was a sparrow or something at first because it was brown and tan. It then hovered, and I saw its arms and legs, and I thought that it was odd, not realizing what it might have been. Its face was almost human, but had bug qualities. It flew off before I was able to react fully, and I haven't seen anything like it since. This story takes place at a church camp, which is sort of like a Christian church camp, when I was 8 years old. It started at night when I was trying to sleep. It was hot, and I felt something heavy was on my chest. Not like a weight, but like a hand. I could feel each individual finger pressing down, almost like it was trying to pierce my chest with its fingertips. When I opened my eyes, I was so scared that I almost burst into tears right then and there. But I felt like if I did, something even worse would happen. Not just to me, but to the other kids in the room with me as well. Instead, I just laid there in my bunk, trying not to keep it from knowing that I was awake. After a few hours, it stopped and left. What I saw when I opened my eyes was a tall, skinny figure with long arms. It had black eyes with red pupils that almost glowed in the dark, large hands with slender fingers, and a mouth so wide, if it opened its mouth, it would look like a hole. When I woke up in the morning, I felt a burning sensation on my chest. When I looked, I saw red marks where the thing had touched me. Things were pretty much normal until the middle of the day, when everyone would go to the main building where we would all attend church and pray. While we were in the middle of a prayer, I opened my eyes to look up at the front of the room, and I saw the figure standing in front of me. And when I saw it, it put one hand over my mouth and pushed the other hand into my chest. It didn't tear a hole in my chest. Instead, it just went inside, like it wasn't there. But I could still feel it inside my chest, its hand wrapped around my heart. Not a squeezing feeling, but a burning feeling, almost like a red-hot fire poker touching bare skin. I was crying the whole time, trying to pull its hand out of my chest, but I wasn't strong enough. And it only stopped after the prayer was over. It just disappeared and was gone. But I could still feel the burning sensation in my chest. After we were done in the church that day, the day continued like normal, like the thing was done doing what it needed to do. After this incident, I never went back to church camp again. And I also stopped going to church, because I never wanted to see that thing ever again. And to this day, I'm happy to say that I haven't seen it since. In 2009, in southeastern Wisconsin, I was in the car home from my mom's. I was in the passenger seat and gazing at the scenery when I saw what looked to be a shadow of a giant bird/pterosaur. It was on the outer wall of a huge factory. I looked up to the sky and saw it disappear into cloud cover. The entire experience lasted about 15 seconds. For years, I assumed that my eyes were playing tricks on me, until I met my new manager at work 2 months ago, who told me a similar story of a giant bird-like creature that he came across while driving. I was instantly brought back to that day, and was assured that although I might be crazy, I did see what I saw. This story is 100% true, and I'm writing it on here to warn other people and let them know that there's definitely something out there. And to this day, I still don't know what it was, nor have I gone into any woods or forest whatsoever. If you don't believe me, that's completely fine. Read this as a fun story at your own expense. But for those of you out there with an open mind, or you've seen something yourself, just know that you're not alone. And just typing out and remembering this account is causing me to shake with anxiety and fear. First off, I'm a girl, and I live in North Carolina of the United States. I was 15 at the time of my encounter, and was definitely not a believer in anything supernatural, paranormal, or anything of the sort. It happened while I was at a local summer camp. There was absolutely nothing special about that day. No weird lights, people, animals, sounds, nothing. It was just the same camp schedule as I'd grown used to in the past 2 weeks that I'd been there. My age group had just finished lunch and was able to persuade our counselor to let us play a game called Scatter down by the lake. It's like a giant hide-and-seek game in the woods. Now, we had played this at least 20 times before that day, and nothing weird had happened to any of us, and we all grew up playing in the woods, so it's not like we had an aversion or fear of it. But for some reason, that day when our counselor shouted Scatter, and I ran to find a hiding place, it became a whole new ball game. I had run as far as I could while still being able to see the lake, as were the rules, and had found a huge old uprooted tree that I decided would be the perfect hiding place. So I laid down as close as I could against the ground and waited. I had been there for about 5 minutes when I suddenly heard a voice calling my name, in a weird, dreamy-like voice, and not just any voice, my mom's. Now, me and my mom are extremely close, thick as thieves, so I'd know her voice anywhere, and I would swear on my own grave that it was hers without a doubt. But I knew that it couldn't be her. She was 20 miles away at work, and even if it had actually been her, and she'd come to pick me up early, the voice wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from further out in the woods, beyond the border of the camp. I knew I should have run away from this strange mimic mom voice, but I couldn't. It was almost hypnotic. It messed with my thoughts and gave me doubts, like, well, it could be mom, or what if she's hurt? And I have to get her. All these things were flooding into my mind, like someone had broken a dam that I didn't know was there, until they finally overwhelmed me, and emotions got the better of me, and I took off running in the direction that the voice was coming from. I ran as far as I could, with only this strange voice as my guide. I couldn't have run for more than 5 or 7 minutes, when I got to a clearing and the voice suddenly stopped. When I entered the clearing and didn't hear my mom's voice calling me anymore, could I finally think clearly again, and started to have little alarm bells going off inside my head, saying, "You idiot, that's not mom," and run. But I couldn't run. I didn't know where to run. I had gotten so far away that I had lost sight of the lake by camp, and had absolutely no idea where I was, and I was completely exhausted to boot. With no other options than to sit and catch my breath, I did just that. No sooner had I sat down, more warning bells went off in my mind. I quickly did a 360 survey around the clearing and noticed a strange noise. It wasn't the continuation of the voice before. No, it was the distinct sound of chattering teeth, like if you were cold, only there was no one else around, and it was the middle of June in North Carolina. There's no way that someone could be cold. And that's when I heard it. Leaves and sticks crunch on the edge of the small clearing, and I realized something was watching me. And then whatever it was moved, and fast, in circles around the clearing, almost like it was circling prey. And it was at that moment that I knew whatever it was had led me out there, away from the rest of my group. Exactly like the predator my instincts had been screaming at me that this was. Without any other option other than to try and escape, I took off in the direction that I thought I came from, and sprinted as fast as I could, all the while hearing the chittering of teeth and sticks crunching behind me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't dare turn around to see what was chasing me. I knew that if I did, I would slow down, and I absolutely would not. It felt like a lifetime running away from this thing before I finally saw the lake. And even though I didn't think that I could, I ran faster than I ever have in my life when I broke the tree line and ran to the lake where I knew that my friends were. At that point, I felt safe enough to stop and look back and just see what had been chasing me. But when I did, I only saw a fleeting form running back the way that I had come from and the distinct sound of chittering teeth. When I finally found my counselor, who was the seeker to find all of us, I was hysterical with fear and hugged her as tight as I could. When I finally calmed down, she tried to get me to tell her what happened, but I just asked, "Were you calling my name?" Before she even said anything, I already knew the answer. After all, it had been my mom's voice that led me away from everyone else. But what she said and what she replied with was so much more bone-chilling to me. She told me, "No one called for you. We didn't know you were gone. Everyone is still hiding. The game isn't over yet." So I just found out that this truly horrifying experience is actually a cryptid. Okay, so this was and still is a truly horrifying and scarring experience that I had last year. Even typing about this gives me anxiety and flashbacks. So the story is very simple, because there's only 3 other encounters with this being that is documented that I know of, and it was very fast but very traumatizing, like I stated earlier in this post. So I stayed up in my room a little bit later than I intended. I was on my computer facing away from my door, and out of the corner of my eye I see him waving at me from around the wall, only exposing his hand and his face. I quickly spun my head around to look, and he was gone, instantly. I sat there, frozen in fear for maybe 10 to 20 minutes. I finally got up and checked behind the wall, and he was gone. Nowhere to be seen. I thought it was some hallucination. But now, I know that I saw Indrid, the grinning man. Back when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I lived and still live in the same apartment. Whenever I would walk down the hallway to my bathroom or my mom's bedroom, I would see strange figures in the dark. Not just shadows, but physical beings that I was able to touch. When I turned 6 years old, I didn't see the figures as often as I used to. But one night, while I was walking down to the bathroom, I was tripped by one of the figures. It didn't just stick its foot out in front of me or anything like that. Instead, it came up through the floor and grabbed me by my ankles. I fell and hit my head on the kitchen bar to my right and got knocked out. When I woke back up, I saw another figure in front of me, and I immediately covered my face, because as a 6-year-old, I still thought that it made the figures ignore me. But instead of it just going past me, it picked me up and put me back on my feet. To this day, I still don't know why the figure helped me, but I do know that not all of the figures were good. Now, I will never go down that hallway without the lights on, even during the day, ever again. I was fishing with a friend, and we heard trees shaking and the tree line was just not right. When my friend said, "Hey, get over here," and he showed me where he had seen something watching me. We start to feel unsettled. Then we started to pack up. And when we got on our four-wheelers is when things started to get weird. We revved it to scare it away. Then we drove off. We were driving off when I dropped a fishing pole. We went back, and when I got back, we looked back and there was a tall, smoke gray, skinny creature. We drove off, and we kept seeing it until we hit the main road. We continued to drive and didn't see anything, but as soon as we drove on a dirt road again, we saw it again. Please, let me know of any information you can give me. This goes back several days/months. I saw what I thought was a dog/wolf's feet running down the road. Couldn't see if it was a dog or a wolf because of the blinds. 1 to 3 days later, at certain times during the day and night, it would sound like something would jump up and crawl over the ventilation unit next to my house. So I looked outside and nothing was there. So I got suspicious, especially because there was no one near the unit. And it would have taken them a long time to get away, because I looked at it immediately through my bedroom window that is 1 to 2 feet away from it to the left. And at night, the noises would come from multiple sides of the house. I thought it was raccoons. 1 to 3 days later, friends that I invited over were complaining about smells like rotten fish/flesh. 1 to 5 days later, the smell went away on its own. And that night, I accidentally stayed up to 2:30 a.m., and I had this feeling to get out of my room and make myself hidden. So I decided to do it because I was bored. I got out of my room and hid behind the wall connecting my room to the kitchen. Then there was a huge bang against the wall next to my window in my room, the place my feeling told me to avoid. Then I froze in fear, in my kitchen, as I heard the sounds of loud bangs, the sounds of running, and the sounds of trash cans falling all over around my house, including on the roof. I managed to make myself move to get my computer and frantically research about what the heck was going on. And I found out, according to this source, that they are most frequently seen as coyotes, wolves, foxes, eagles, owls, or crows. My grandmother also saw a coyote or wolf when she was coming to visit me. I also heard that they smell like things rotting because of their flesh, and that they try to break into the house or harass you by doing most of the noises that I listed. These creatures were trying to lure me outside the whole time that I was researching by mimicking a woman's voice. Today, the smell is back, and I don't know how to ward them off. My grandpa was telling me a story in the summertime, and I guess I never felt the need to share because I didn't know what platform to share it on. But I found one. I apologize if some of the details are left out. I've forgotten some of the things that he told me, such as names and what year this happened in. I believe it happened in the 60s. It happened near the Sandy Bay Aboriginal Reserve, which is in southern Manitoba. It was midwinter, and Manitoba gets plenty of snow. My grandpa told me that his 2 friends, a wife and husband, were walking from their car to their house, carrying all of their luggage. It was just their cabin, not their house, so they were carrying the luggage up to the cabin. The first thing they noticed was a bright light shining into the cabin. It illuminated the entire cabin and was a fluorescent shade of icy blue. The husband thought he saw a silhouette of a strange tall humanoid in the home. It was lanky and very tall, standing alone, before it walked out of sight. Quickly, he ran into the house with his wife. They searched the house, and there was nothing. So the wife went back out to grab more luggage. The husband said that he heard a shriek from outside, and quickly ran out to make sure that she was okay. He was shocked to find her footprints leading up to the car. Yet she was about 25 feet away from the car in the woods, with no tracks leading towards her. If she were to walk out there by herself, Her tracks would obviously be there. He ran out to her. She was distraught and hollering and screaming, and her eyes were glazed over. He took her in and she refused to speak. She was admitted into the mental hospital soon after, and to this day has the same glossed over eyes, and she still can't speak. She experienced a horrible trauma out there, and I believe that it's because of whatever the humanoid creature was. My grandpa still talks to her husband sometimes, and I believe that he visited her about 30 years ago at the hospital, since he doesn't live too many hours away. If anyone has any theories about this, feel free to comment. Or if there are any more questions, I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. I used to work at a cheese factory on the edge of a cornfield in southwestern Minnesota. There were a series of days in the summer of '04 or '05 where it was so hot that the milk being delivered to us in trucks would evaporate before we got it. It made work easy. The dearth of milk denied us any actual labor, but management wouldn't let us not come to work, so we would show up and mess around all shift. I was working nights at the time. It was 2 or 3 a.m., and I was out on the loading dock watching bats fly around the floodlights, because I liked being out in the cool night air. The corn was about as high as my shoulder, so about 5'10". As I was watching the bats, I looked down at the edge of the cornfield. Something was moving there. It was the size of a small child, and very, very skinny. Pale, with something that looked like a head of straight black hair. It moved in a sort of jerky gait, like someone dancing the robot really badly. It moved in chunks. Legs, then hips, then torso, shoulders, neck, and finally head. It was looking back into the cornfield, or at least I felt like it was. I felt prickly all over. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a heron or something at first, but it looked too much like a person. It didn't move like a person, though. Gradually, step by step, it moved towards me. Letting my curiosity better my fear, I moved towards the edge of the dock, which was raised a few feet off the ground. When I got within a few feet of the edge, the thing looked at me. I was paralyzed. I could have run, but I was stuck somewhere between terrified and intrigued. It moved. Its face still pointed at me. It ratcheted its body in that disconcerting, jerky movement toward the cornfield and went into it. I tried to watch where the field moved as it passed, but the corn remained perfectly still. I noticed that all the crickets were silent. After a few minutes, nothing happened. I stood out there for an hour, but it never came back, and I never saw it again. I'm an outdoorsman. I'm very experienced in hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival. I'm familiar and used to wildlife, and I was charged by what I believe was a cryptid called a dogman. It charged me and my cousin. It was not a bear. A bear cannot move how it did. And it was not a normal wolf, as they can't comfortably run on 2 legs, whereas what charged us seemed natural at doing that. This happened around June or July of 2007, I believe. I was around 17 years old and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwestern Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night, it was wise to stay in the cabin, or at least by the bonfire by the beach, because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach, and at night, You always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy. That is, until this incident. So this happened somewhere between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo. He was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters into about a third of the way up the trail. We had enough at this point, and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail, talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me when I decided to mess with him. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized that the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked, and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds. But it wasn't normal. This wolf was on 2 legs crouching next to the tree, with its arm grasping the tree, grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin that we have to go, and the next thing I know, he is sprinting, and I look back at Wolfie, who had locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet, and then I turned and ran when it looked like Wolfie was dropping to all 4s. It charged us, and sounded like it was right on our butts barreling through the brush. But for whatever reason, it let us go when we broke out of the tree line and headed for the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. Wolfie appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright. And that's where I should have expected had front paws. It appeared to have large clawed hands. Now, I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I've heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs. Nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more waddle on 2 legs. The closest description is silly: a werewolf or a dog man. I just wanted to share an incident that I experienced in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where I went to high school. I was in a video production class, right around the time the movie The Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere was being made. So we decided to make a documentary. We spoke to a woman in her 70s, who, during the time of the original sightings back in the 60s, said that she was out riding her horse one day, and she said that she suddenly felt someone sit down behind her. All of a sudden, the horse bucked her off and went crazy. She chased the horse down and then looked at the horse. Burned into the flesh of the horse were the legs of a humanoid. She immediately got in contact with a veterinarian, who came to her farm to treat the horse. The veterinarian never asked how the horse got burned, as if he had seen this type of burn before. Other than the burn, the horse was fine. Later that week, she confided to a friend that whatever it was that sat behind her on the horse had very thin insect-like legs. She also said that it had the odor of ammonia. She also said that when she backed off of the horse, she caught a glimpse of the being on the horse. She saw huge butterfly-like wings that were yellow in color. She swears up and down that this was the Mothman. Also, it turns out that the veterinarian was one of the 46 victims who died during the Silver Bridge collapse on December 15th, 1967. I just thought that that was an interesting story. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, my uncle told me a story that has stuck with me ever since. Growing up in Kentucky, I've always heard tales of, Bigfoot or the Pope Lick Goat Man, the usual run-of-the-mill urban legend campfire story. But in the case of the story my uncle had told me, it was different than all the other tall tales that I had heard before or since. Kentucky is home to the world's largest cave system in the world, Mammoth Cave. Since its founding on July 1st of 1941, only about 365 miles have been surveyed by the human eye. It's believed that there are still over 600 miles of passageways and caverns yet to be discovered. The national park is stretched over 3 counties, spanning more than 50,000 acres: Edmonson, Hart, and Barron counties. My uncle owned land in Edmonson County since the early 1980s. I remember hearing about how when they were out hunting for deer, they would occasionally come across pits in the ground of various sizes. They were the mouths of cave entrances. They would usually just toss a barrel or a large tree branch into the hole so no one would stumble across it, fall in, and become trapped. Besides wildlife or just getting lost in the woods, there really wasn't much else that you had to worry about, according to most people. This story takes place in the early 1990s, about 5 years after my uncle had purchased the land. His closest neighbor, who I'll call Ken, lived about a half a mile down the dirt road that ran parallel to both of their properties. They naturally became good friends over time, and on occasion would accompany each other hunting. My uncle lived in Louisville, and would visit his property whenever he had days off, or needed to do upkeep, like mowing or restocking his pond. So unlike his neighbor Ken, he spent more than most of the year in Louisville. On this particular weekend, Ken went out hunting for deer. He left his cabin and headed off into the woods, as he had done 100 times before. He followed a path that he had used plenty of times, to a small grouping of trees, overlooking a large meadow. According to him, it was a perfect sunny fall day, with not many clouds in the sky. He sat in the shadows underneath some low-hanging tree branches, feeling hidden from any would-be prey that might come by. Despite it being the ideal weather for hunting, he didn't see much in terms of game. Just a few fawn and a doe, not the big trophy buck that he was hoping for. He had been entertaining the idea of just grabbing his gear and heading back to the cabin, but not wanting to go home empty-handed, he decided to stick around for just a little while longer, in hopes that his luck would change. His chest fluttered when he looked across the meadow to the left and seen movement in the tree line opposite of him. He pulled his rifle to his shoulder and looked down the scope. The thick trees and foliage at the edge of the tree line prevented him from getting a good view of the animal in his sights. From what he could tell, it was heading towards the edge of the woods. He just had to be patient. When it stepped out of the shadows of the trees about 50 yards away and into the clearing, he knew almost immediately that he wasn't looking at a deer. He tried to keep his hands from shaking, as he desperately tried to identify exactly what it was that he was looking at. He described its body of that of a panther, but the upper torso where the shoulders and neck were sat noticeably higher than its lower back and hind legs. He was looking at its side profile, which he claimed while in mid-stride, this thing had to be close to 7 feet in length. He said it was quiet like a cat. It never made a noise when it moved. The front legs, he said, looked more like arms, significantly longer and skinnier than its hind legs. It had brittle dark brown hair that started from the back of its head and running down the length of its back. He also claimed that the creature's skin looked waxy, almost like a chimpanzee's skin, dark brown, almost black. Its face was long like a dog's, but he said he noticed no ears. He said the corners of its mouth ended by the neck, where the ears should be. The most unsettling detail that I can remember of his account, though, was the thing's back legs. He described them as looking frog-like, as in the back legs were tucked up close to the creature's sides. When it walked, the leading leg would reach almost to the front half of its body, and the other leg would stretch way back, flat, like a frog when it crawls. He watched it for about 2 or 3 minutes, slowly and quietly moving through the long golden grass. A black shadow surrounded by color. He watched it disappear into the tree line directly across from the woods that he's seen it come from initially. After a few moments, he left and headed back to his cabin. Now, I don't know how long it was after this incident occurred that Ken told my uncle about it, but he was reluctant to speak on it. He dubbed it the Kentucky Holler Crawler. Eventually, Ken explained the story in full one night while sat around a fire with my uncle. Ever since then, Ken refused to go into the woods. He claimed to only hunt from the dirt road running through his property afterward. Both my uncle and Ken have sadly passed away since, but their story never changed over the years. I even had my uncle retell the story to me a few years back, just so that I knew I had all the details right. Maybe this was just another tall tale used to scare me and my brother when we were kids, camping on my uncle's land. But I know one thing for sure. He was an honest man, and his eyes told the truth when he would tell me that story. He had his fair share of unexplainable incidents as well. I'm sure that anybody would after frequenting a cabin in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky over 30 years. The thing that keeps me up at night, though, isn't the thought of the creature. It's the thought of where it came from. Who's to say this thing didn't crawl up from one of the caves, spanning hundreds of miles in every direction, hidden from civilization, thriving off the ecosystem? Nothing is impossible when it comes to nature. Nobody really knows for sure what is out there in the dark. This took place in the Rockies in Colorado a few days ago. I just seek help trying to figure out if I'm crazy or bumped into something. I'd heard the stories, read plenty of them online, and seen the videos about them as well. I was never sure about them, never sure if they were real, probably because I didn't want them to be, because whether I'd admit it or not, they were creepy, but I couldn't rule them out. I was camping, half an hour outside of a small town in Colorado at about 8,500 feet. Snow covered the dirt road I took to get to the campsite. I'd only set it up earlier that day. 10 to 15 minutes of my drive out of town was through the park, with campsites essentially clearings with stone fire pits in them. I set up at the fourth or fifth one. I was the only camper there at the time. On one of my returns to camp, after visiting in town about 100 feet down the 1 to 1.5 miles into the park, I saw a herd of deer off to the left side of my trail, probably 7 to 8 of them. There were only a few feet from the trail, and all spooked, save for one deer. The deer was facing the same direction of the car before I came, and was the closest to the pathway. While the other deer retreated 15 to 20 feet deeper into the woods, he turned to face my car. Already only going 5 to 10 miles per hour, and on a rough part of the trail, I wasn't passing very quickly, so I slowed and stopped. He followed the whole way. For some reason, I spoke to him. I, unsure and slightly uneasy at this fearless deer. After all, I'm treading on his land. I was protected in the car, and he was an average-sized deer, so there was no reason to think that it'd do anything to me. But somehow, some way, an animal demanded respect. I don't think I ever saw it blink. For what felt like forever, but was likely 5 minutes, we stared at each other. The deer never moving anything about him. I thought to take a picture of him and his herd watching from behind him down the hill, but something told me not to. I talk to my dogs, and I know they hear what I say, but I don't know if they listen. He listened. I told the deer I was here to visit, that I wished for a brief stay and to hopefully enjoy nature again, and grow appreciation for nature once more. As if satisfied by the answer, he backed up. Only a couple of steps, but he backed up and I kept on. I drove and watched him in the mirror. He returned to the herd, not taking an eye off of me. I've been on plenty of camping trips, been spooked by people and critter alike wandering around camp, even having opened the flap to a deer walking through on many a trip with the scouts. But this was one of my first alone. Up there, it dropped to around 0 degrees, and when I was in the tent, all I wanted to do was huddle in my sleeping bag. So that's what I did. The sun went down quick when you're tucked between peaks. The mountains hide the sun even sooner, so it got dark and cold. If you ever watched a four-legged animal walk, you'll know its pattern. Having been around dogs all my life, it's something that I've mildly found interesting. Almost always after a forefoot comes down, a rear foot follows, giving a distinct sound to their footsteps. When I was woken up at around 2 to 3 in the morning, my first thought was a bear late to hibernate. Knowing I had no food in the tent and only had food in the car, I stayed huddled as to not startle it or give it any reason to think that I smelled like food after all. I tried to listen to it to see where it was walking. That's when I got scared. There was snow surrounding my camp. There was no mistaking every single footstep it made. Slow. One on front of the other. No matter how hard I tried to imagine, there was no rear foot following. Just 1, 2, 1, 2. Then the pause. That was the worst part. I slipped my hand out of my bag that I was huddled in and grabbed the hatchet that I was carrying with me, trying to reassure myself that I was making stuff up. I pulled my hand back in and I heard it start to walk off again, keeping on its way. The direction that it had been going before, stepping into my camp, and eventually I couldn't hear its slow steps anymore. It was light and two-legged. That's all that I could discern. The next morning I went to look. Even with the snow, it was so packed around my sight from cars and footsteps that it was either too packed or already walked over to really discern any new tracks. I stayed in a hotel the night after this happened, abandoning my gear to pack in the sunlight. 3 to 4 inches of fresh, dry snow had come down over the night, and when I walked into my camp, I noticed a trail of tracks. While the terrain was still uneven, I couldn't help but notice what looked like a set of tracks slightly together, like you would see a deer's tracks. And suddenly, as they left the grass and entered the dirty snow of camp, they seemed to be spaced out, almost like my own footsteps that I left behind walking over to them were. If it were a skinwalker, it makes sense if it were the deer that I spoke to, as they tend to not be violent in the day. But being a hunter, it saw and paid attention to where its next target would be going. But when it went on the prowl, only finding a quiet tent. Or it could have been a wendigo, content with my goals of the forest, letting me leave, but coming by in the night as a warning of what was to come, seeing as what I drove into was headed for the mountains. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra thunderstorm sounds at the end. Get a great night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.